Okay, so we are talking about the history of policing. And so we are talking about how we currently live in a free society, and policing in a free society is hard because they are government officials who are charged with enforcing the law, and they are able to use coercive force in order to ensure that we as citizens comply. And so those mandates have been developed really over time. And today we're going to talk about kind of where we are with policing today, because I feel like a lot of understanding policing today really requires an understanding of where we've come and how we've gotten here. So this is a timeline that I created. The history of policing is very, very detailed. There's a ton of stuff that is going on. But I just wanted to give you like a quick kind of overview of some of the things that we are going to be talking about in terms of kind of this development. So first, we're going to start kind of with the origins of policing. And so we have to realize that really kind of we didn't have formal policing until probably like the 16th, 17th like centuries. So prior to even like the 1100s, we lived in very agrarian societies where everything was very farmland. We didn't have major cities or anything like that. Everyone essentially just kind of policed themselves. And so in a lot of societies, all the way to ancient civilization, we had what we called kin policing. And this means essentially just everyone was responsible for policing the behavior of everyone, either in their family, in the tribe, or their clan. They were responsible for policing their own. And this was brutal because there was like no standard. So if someone like stole, a cow, then the victim would then be responsible for policing that situation, so they could go and like chop that person's hand off. So it was not a whole lot of standards in terms of how people were policed, but it was essentially this idea is if you violate someone or something in the tribe, then everyone in the tribe is responsible for policing that. Additionally, a lot of kind of developing communities use what we call night watchmen, and these were essentially just able-bodied men. Men were the only ones that could do this, and it was a requirement by law that men had to patrol the streets at night in order to, prevent crime and disorder that was happening. However, it sucked a lot because a lot of people didn't want to be the police. Still to this day, we have a lot of people that don't want to be a police officer. They don't want to deal with conflict. And so that's why we have police, so that they can come and deal with the conflict and maintain order, reduce crime, things like that. But at this time, it was every man was supposed to basically serve a shift, and they were required to stay up at night and patrol the streets. And it sucked because it was like a citizen duty, so you didn't get paid. A lot of people were very unwilling to do this, and it was very ineffective because people would just show up wasted. And then if you had the means, you could pay someone else to cover your shift. But what that meant is that they were paying people who were never sober, and so they'd show up. They'd be the worst people that we want as police officers, and so there was a lot of corruption and police brutality and things like that. Additionally, we also had something called shire reeves, and this is where we actually get the concept of the sheriff. And so this was an extension of the crown. And so this was also over in Europe. And so when we're talking about the crown, we're talking about what we know as prosecutors. So they essentially worked for the legal system. Shire reefs were really responsible for ensuring that the laws were being enforced. But really, when we talk about kind of shire reefs and sheriffs over time, their primary responsibility was a tax collector. And so once we started to pay taxes and things like that, like the shire reefs or the sheriffs were the ones that were responsible for coming and collecting those taxes. And so as a result, they were wildly unpopular, right? They would have to come and find you. And if you didn't pay, you could be punished, right? So I think this is important because understanding that, people and authority figures have to have this understanding that, when you are in a position of power, you cannot be everyone's best friend. And officers understand that, they don't get into this job to be everyone's best friend. We all collectively understand that that's why the government for the people, we consent to be policed. we put people that we deem to be responsible in charge of maintaining that order. And so when you have someone that is responsible for enforcing the rules, people who don't like to follow the rules are not going to like those that are making them follow the rules. So even though they were just collecting taxes, wildly unpopular. And this really kind of continued throughout kind of the history. So really, we haven't even gotten to formalize policing as of what we know it today. Really until kind of the reforms in the 1700s, 1800s over in Europe. So, but we still have to talk about policing in colonial America, because really around kind of the 1600s, so I mean 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So we obviously had people that were coming over to America, and they were developing the colonies. And so before we really started to develop like formalized police departments, we had very kind of similar roles and responsibilities that were similar to Europe, but distinct in the names in America. So offices like the sheriff, the constable, and also like the watch. So we borrowed this from England. And so the sheriff, this was appointed by the colonial governor. And again, they were responsible for collecting taxes, conducting elections, making sure they had the resources to maintain roads and bridges, and then also kind of enforcing the law. We also had what we called constables, and constables really kind of developed out of a need of manpower, because again, a lot of these positions were like required by law. People didn't like that, and they would try to get out of it at all costs. And so a lot of times the people that were trying to maintain order needed additional help. And so that's where constables kind of came in. And we still have constables in the United States. They are very popular in Texas. And a lot of times constables in Texas are really responsible for enforcing civil related matters. So like serving subpoenas, protection orders, doing a lot of kind of civil service responsibilities for communities. But if you ever hear these terms, these are kind of where they came from. And then additionally, we also had something that was very similar called the watch, right? And so you had people that were patrolling the communities at night. And then when they would find disorder or crime, they would shout out a hue and cry. And so imagine, like, this is crazy too, right? Because we didn't have motorized vehicles, like we didn't have any technology like cell phones or even just like mobile phones, radios, things like that. Like this is the 1600s. So it'd be like, imagine if you were on patrol and you saw someone getting into a fight at the stadium on campus, but you are over, at McKay Hall where we are. And so you're getting called by your other night watchman to go over there. And so it's, I mean, unless you're jogging, it's going to take you a second to go over there. So shockingly, policing in colonial America was not super effective or great. And so we didn't have anybody patrolling the day shift. That tended to come a little bit later. But again, it was an unpaid position. It was required by law. They first started to do it with like volunteers, but then again, the people who would volunteer weren't the best for the job. And then the people who could afford it would really just pay people to show up for their shift. And those people that would show up for the shift were usually intoxicated and use excessive force, things like that. So again, kind of looking at early policing in colonial America, it was super inefficient, very corrupt, and it was 100% controlled by politicians. And so in recognizing this need that we needed to control crime and disorder, there was also some underlying messages with that have kind of that have kind of translated across all these different areas. So we talked about some of these. Really, what's kind of quintessential about this area is everything was very reactive, meaning that people would respond to complaints. Nobody was even talking about like preventing crime until we started to see a lot of the reforms in Europe. And so corruption was rampant, right? So they would find people committing crimes. And so they'd be like, well, if you give me money, then, I won't have to arrest you. So dramatic abuses of power, because at this point, the power was unchecked. The people who were responsible for policing were really the politicians. So as long as the police officers were doing what the politicians wanted and whoever was in charge politically, then there wasn't really any issues. But to the citizens, they realized that the police were essentially just put in place to maintain the interests of the people that were in power. And so also kind of at this time, we are still in the 1600s, so we haven't even started talking about like modernized, actually established police forces. And so what's really interesting is we've had these laws on the books at the time that were primarily centered around kind of this white supremacy, right? Because slavery was 100% illegal and was also a primary means of income, or not primary means of income for the farmers and things like that, working in the transatlantic slave trade, things like that. So much so in 1690, South Carolina passed a law that basically allowed any white person to capture and punish a runaway slave. So when you hear about things like citizen arrest laws, like that is generally where a lot of these laws emerge from, is this idea that people of color, people that were slaves, did not have any rights and they were owned as property. So much so that Michael Hindis, who's a historian, wrote, as long as Charlestonians believed that Blacks were the sole threat to order, white supremacy served in lieu of a police force. We also saw Southern cities develop like these paramilitary groups that were solely tasked with ensuring that slaves abided by their owners. And then if they fled or tried to go to the free states, it was really the slave patrols that would be responsible for apprehending them and returning them. And so unfortunately, these were kind of the first kind of antecedents of what we now know as state police agencies. So when we hear a lot of issues about like systemic racism and things like that, that essentially means that what it doesn't mean is that officers who are working for, that work for the police are inherently racist. That is not what systemic racism means. It means that these institutions have developed over time from institutions that were really designed to kind of control the lower majority. And so at the time in the 1700s, slavery was considered the norm. And so obviously over time, we outlawed slavery, and slavery is abominable. But we have to realize that just because slavery was abolished doesn't mean that racism and people's perceptions of people of color changed as well. And so definitely like they have changed over time, but there's still evidence to show that even up until the past kind of 20 years, the way that certain demographics are portrayed in the media often is related to crime. And since we generally get a lot of our information about policing and crime from the media, there is solid evidence to show that what we are seeing is really very skewed towards like very, very violent crimes, generally by people of color, and against generally people who are white or of privilege and things like that. So when we're talking about systemic racism, we are not saying that the police are racist. Some may have that opinion. When we talk about recruitment and training, we will definitely see the efforts that agencies go through to really vet out the people we do not want in policing. But it is something to keep in the back of our minds that contemporary policing comes from institutes that were predominantly designed to help people in power control some of the lower class. And then this was predominantly in the South, but we also have to realize that racism is not necessarily specific to the South. There's other sides that I had in here that we weren't going to have time to cover, but there's also racist laws up in the Northeast and the 13 colonies as well. And so understanding this, I think this is important for us to understand policing today. And for those of you that want to become police officers, is understanding that a lot of this conflict that is happening today is rooted in centuries of policing. And so it's great that we now have officers that are wanting to get into policing for the right reasons, to show that they're giving back to their community and things like that, but understanding that a lot of the frustration from communities of color is really from centuries of kind of over policing and what they perceive as despair or unfair kind of practices towards them versus wealthier, predominantly white communities. So stepping off my soapbox, because we got to get back into this. So I want to get eventually into American policing. So really around the 19th century, we saw dramatic changes, not only in Europe, but in the United States as well. One is the Industrial Revolution and urbanization. So essentially you have to realize like So in the beginning, we had these agrarian societies where everything was very much farmland, very rural. And over time, we started to modernize our technology. And so we started to have, this led to the development of the Industrial Revolution, where we started to see increase in factories and tons of jobs that were happening, really in everyone kind of fleeing to America, lots of immigrants coming to America because of the Industrial Revolution, lots of jobs to work in factories, manufacturing, different things like that. And so because there was this dramatic change happening in society with urbanization, and so we're starting to see these cities start to develop and lots of people coming in to seek jobs. What happens is, even though America could be a melting pot, when you have a rush of people with all different norms, beliefs, respects, kind of living in the same area for the same purpose, which is to go to work, there tends to be a lot of conflict that can happen. And so knowing that, so at the time in London, they were suffering some insane poverty, disorder, lots of controversies with immigrants. There was riots between Irish immigrants and English citizens. And this really led to the development of the Metropolitan Police Act of 1829. And so this really reformed the watch that we talked about to really resemble more of a modern police department. So first of all, the reformers were saying, well, this needs to be a paid position, because the people just requiring people to become a police officer, terrible, because they're not showing up to do their job. And if they are, a lot of times they're not great at their job and they're not sober. So increase the pay. We can't just be doing a night watch. We also need to be doing a day watch. And so therefore, this developed like the round the clock, 24 hours, 7 days a week kind of emergency services. And then also established like in a hierarchy, because so much of the corruption was occurring because there wasn't really any oversight. And so this is where we started to develop supervisors. Your lieutenants, your sergeants, all the way up to, we didn't really have police chiefs at the time, but we started to develop what we call this hierarchical structure, meaning that you have the rank and file. It adopted a lot from the military at the time. You have the rank and file, and then it moves up in a hierarchy. So you don't automatically go to the police chief, you go to the person that's above you, and then they carry your message up the ranks and bring it back down. This is how that operated at the time. So while these reforms were happening, this led to the development of the London Metropolitan Police Force. And so this is really kind of the first modern police agency in the world. And so again, paid positions, round-the-clock services, hierarchical command, and this is what we eventually adopted in the United States, because a lot of the English reformers were coming over to the United States, developed 13 colonies, and because we need people to maintain law and order, we started to develop kind of these informal policing systems. Sir Robert Peel, he's known as kind of the father of modern policing. He was the one that really streamlined a lot of these reforms that were happening. So he really focused on this idea of that the police should be the police of the people for the people, meaning that we need to really increase our standards of who we're hiring as police officers. They should be quality individuals, and the mission of policing should really focus on prevention. And so one of the ways that Sir Robert Peel was talking about prevention was this idea that like we need to be distinct from the general public. And so if you've ever kind of wondered where like police uniforms came from, like this is generally what he's talking about. And so people need to be able to see who the police are, one, so that they could go to them if they need help, but two, it also serves as a deterrent, right? So if you are going to commit crime, you're not going to do it in front of someone that is in a blue uniform. And so even though like the London Metropolitan Police Force was developing uniforms and weapons didn't really come standard in the United States until like the 1900s. And so a lot of times police officers had either a distinct hat or a badge, but they didn't have the full blues really until the 1900s. So in terms of some of the key reforms of how they reformed policing in London that carried over to the United States is a lot of what we see today. currently in contemporary policing. So again, a lot of what policing is focused on is crime prevention. Robert Peel believed that it's better to prevent crime than having to respond after the fact, especially because responding after the fact wasn't effective. We still did not have technology. Motorized vehicles were not a thing. This was solely foot patrol, and it could be relatively exhausted, and you may not get to someone who is calling for help for 45 minutes to an hour because you're running across town on your feet. Sometimes they have horses. Really, this idea of prevention focused on the idea of preventative patrol. And so we see this currently with preventative patrol. So when you are a police officer and you are on patrol, you are generally assigned to a specific beat, and you patrol that area. And how you patrol the area really is up to you. It's kind of like this randomized patrol. You are serving as a deterrent, but you're also being proactive and looking for crime. And so when Robert Peel was talking about how the police need to be of the police of the community, he really wanted officers to be a visible presence in their community. So they were assigned to these beats, and this was essentially just the neighborhoods that they patrol, which we still have today. If you ever go on a ride along, officers will tell you like, oh, we're assigned to this area of town, and that's all we do is patrol in that area. And the last ride along that I went on was in December, and it was with the Fort Collins Police Department, and we were assigned to South Fort Collins. And within an hour, like it gets boring because you are just going down kind of the same routes, switching it up a little bit, really just waiting for calls for service, but you're also looking for crime. So they really wanted, visible presence in the community, but also for community members to know who their neighborhood officers were. And if they knew that officers were in their community, then it would serve as a visible deterrent towards crime. And then also borrowing from the military, we saw a dramatic change in the structure. So we saw uniforms, we saw rank designations, so patrol all the way to captain, sergeant, and then really kind of an authoritarian system of command and discipline. So it was very much like the military, and that rank and file, how information gets transferred, and then there are also expectations and consequences for those. And so this is where we kind of developed the quasi-military style that exists today in current policing, meaning that we have officers that serve a distinct kind of mission, that have uniforms, that are present in their community, that are solely focused on preventing and reducing crime, providing services, and it also has a hierarchical organization. And so that's what we're talking about, a quasi-military, in that like we have different ranks, and it's generally a what is horizontal? Vertical. This is horizontal, vertical. It's a vertical hierarchy where it goes all the way up to the police chief, all the way down. And so we still have this to this day, but the way that information is communicated is much different now. You have a lot more police chiefs who do not care about information going up through the ranks. If there is a frontline officer, a patrol officer that has a question or wants to talk to the chief, they can go directly to the chief now. A lot of chiefs have this like kind of open door policy, but that is really kind of more recent because we've had this kind of hierarchical organizational structure for quite some time. Okay, so police departments were really formally started to be established in the United States around the 1800s. And a lot of this, so even though communities were developing in America, in colonial America, and even in the South, communities still had a lot of issues with immigration, right? Because as these communities were developing, also in America, we also participated in the Industrial Revolution and also urbanization of major cities. And so with that became tons of opportunities in jobs. So that is why America is the land of opportunities. So we had an influx of people coming to America in order to make money. And so as a result of kind of this increasing melting pot of people from all different backgrounds and beliefs and ideas, it really kind of created a lot of fear in these kind of urban environments. And that led to a lot of crime, a lot of riots, and really kind of a call for more police protection. And so knowing that what was going on with the London Metropolitan Police Force, a lot of the European reformers were adopting some of those principles and bringing them over here to the United States. So normally, I usually tell people that the Boston Police Department was the first modern police department in the United States. It's said to be established in 1838. Yet other policing scholars argue that it was the New York City Police Department that was the first to be the first full-time paid police force in 1844. And so, of course, because I'm a researcher, I try to fact check this. And one thing I thought was interesting was on the Boston Police Department's website, they do not say that they were the first modern police department. They say they were established in 1838, but there's not a whole lot of information describing that they were the first. So if they're not even coming out with that, controversy. So, but essentially, policing in the United States, the formal modernized police departments really developed over in the East Coast and made their Western expansion through slave patrols, vigilantes. But then additionally, we started police departments basically spread like smallpox because everyone realizes that we needed them. And so in the very origins of modern police departments in the United States, they really developed in this era of what we now call the political era. And this lasted from anywhere from the 1800s to the 1920s. And so what was unique about the political era is that, one, politics controlled everything. And so essentially the police at the time were just an extension of political power. And so we had what was called the patronage system, which essentially is you hire your friends and who you know. So if I am running for colonial governor, and I'm going to stack the police department with people that I know are going to carry out what I want them to do. So if I don't like certain communities, I'm going to tell the police chief or whoever I put in charge to dedicate all their officers to this area, don't take any mercy, and make sure people are going to vote for me. And so you literally had officers that were taking bribes and basically saying like, we're going to arrest you unless you vote for Dr. Brady. Otherwise, it's going to be a world of pain. We're going to keep coming back. So there was a lot of intimidation, very, very corrupt happening not only in politics, but with the officers as well. But also we saw an influx of people getting into this job because at the time, the job paid relatively well given the circumstances. And so their primary role was really to maintain order. And what that really kind of meant was code word for like controlling the lower classes. So the people who had like mental health issues, who were low income, who were working in the factories, who were immigrants, people of color, like they wanted to keep them away from the people who were in power. And so as a result of a lot of the corruption, they really had kind of limited staffing. There was a ton of turnover because, the officers were, for the most part, still showing up intoxicated. There wasn't really any like formal education or training that was required. It was like, if you were a man and were in bad health or in good health, then you could essentially become a police officer. Women were not allowed to be in policing, and the first sworn female police officer was in the Chicago Police Department in like 1910. And even then, they didn't even have like arrest powers, and they were primarily focused on units that dealt with crimes against children and generally like juveniles. So because citizens did not like the police, they didn't like this idea of a formalized government infringing on their rights. They just thought once we started establishing modern police forces that they would just take over and basically do the biddings of the higher class politicians and people in power. And their concerns were not out of the norm because that's pretty much what the political era consisted of, was a lot of corruption. So we'll talk about some key areas in policing, but really what is important to understand for the political era is that it's during the political eras when we first started to establish modern police departments in the United States. Their sole focus was really to maintain order in the community, to make sure people weren't committing crimes and causing riots and trying to overthrow the government. And then three, that it was like relatively terrible. They were terrible police officers. There wasn't any training. It was just willy-nilly, and a lot of them were just hired by the people in charge to carry out their responsibilities. So shockingly, because it was so corrupt and officers were terrible at their jobs, led to a lot of reforms that were happening. So as the United States started to become much more modern, we shifted towards what we now call the professional era. So really what was guiding the professional era is these four kind of primary goals. And so at the time, the primary goal of officers was to really maintain order. And so a lot of the reformers really focused on this idea of, well, let's professionalize this profession. Let's actually get people who are good at their jobs, who are smart. Let's get them into training. Let's expand who is going to be a police officer. And so instead of maintaining order, we want to change the police to these crime experts. They become these experts in crime. And so this is where we started to see a lot of forensics, and not forensics in the way that we know today. Really, when we say forensics, we're talking about like fingerprints, but also advances in technology as well. So this is where we started to see a lot of patrol cars, telephones, two-way radios, things like that. The whole goal of the professional era was really to remove politics out of policing. And really, the way that they did that is by implementing much more professionalization standards and hiring people to basically run police departments that really didn't have any, that weren't being controlled or influenced by politics. And so it was really about eliminating corruption that was happening, rebuilding, eliminating corruption, making sure officers become much more effective at crime fighting. And we were gonna formalize the profession and make it much more professional, so people know that policing is a legitimate profession that requires, honor, dedication, integrity, things like that. Okay. I just want to take a break to just check the chat. So if any of you have any questions, thoughts, comments, or concerns, feel free to do that. I will check that throughout the rest of the class. Let me take a sip. All right, I painted you the picture. So we're now in like the 20s, 1930s, and citizens are kind of fed up with the police. They don't really feel like they're being effective. They're still concerned about like government, basically having all this power. And so a lot of the reformers focused on how can we improve policing and develop a much better legitimacy with the community. And so one of the first things that happened in the professional era of positive outcomes was really sorry. All right, there we go. Professionalization of the industry. So this meant that like a focus on that the police are going to be public servants, and they have this professional obligation to serve the entire community and not just what politicians wanted. So professionalization, making sure that all communities had officers that were working them versus just low-income neighborhood. And so the service role changed from a maintaining order all the way to this crime fighting role, meaning that they don't want to respond to what we call service-related calls now. If the call was not about a crime-related issue, they didn't want to deal with it. And then when they responded, this is where we get a lot of the just the facts, ma'am. Like they don't want the whole story of what happened. They want, why am I here? What are the main facts? That's all I need to investigate this crime. They weren't about building rapport with the community. It was solely focusing on how can we fight crime. And they also raised personnel standards. So they established minimum recruitment requirements, like for intelligence, they had to be in good health, they had to have a good moral character. And then we also, so in addition to professionalization, that's where we also started to see a lot of training academies. So if you ever hear about POST, it's the Peace Officer Standards and Training Program. That is what officers go through in order to become a sworn police officer. So upon completing POST, they can be sworn in, and that's when they have the arrest powers. But not only POST academies, we also saw the development of criminology programs. And so we wanted officers to become much more of these crime experts. And so in order to do that, we wanted to train people about crime and disorder that was happening in communities. And so there was the first criminology program was at UC Berkeley. It was created by August Vollmer, who is a prolific policing, not necessarily a scholar because he was a practitioner, but he was the one that really led a lot of these reforms. And in addition to the criminal justice programs, they also helped improve supervision. And a lot of that was removing politics out of controlling the police department and putting people who actually had management training and skills to basically run these organizations. And so that's when we started to see the development of police chiefs and them taking a prominent role and really reforming a lot of the issues that were happening in policing. And then as police departments became much more professionalized, officers could start specializing in a lot more specific types of crimes. And so as modern police departments became larger and much more complex, we started to see the development of specialized units. So units that focus on like drugs, vice crimes, crimes against children and adolescents. And so these specialized units came up, which was also a marketing tool for agencies to get higher quality individuals who wanted to become a police officer. And then, like I said, we also had dramatic improvements in technology. So lots of good positive outcomes that are still happening in today. So if you are familiar with anything that started to happen in the 1960s and 1970s, America was going through a lot of social and political movements. So the civil rights movement, the women's movement, we started to see a lot of dramatic changes that were seen as controversial. You had a lot of wealthy white communities that didn't like this idea of integration. And this also, we don't have a whole lot of time to talk about it, but this is also something that is an issue when we talk about kind of where high crime areas are. Thomas Abbott, or App, is a criminologist who wrote a book called Bleeding Out, and he talks about how we can actually reduce crime in very high crime areas. And I thought he said something that was interesting, is that crime does not cause poverty, poverty causes crime. And so if we are arresting people, putting them in prison, and ruining their chances of being able to be successful people in society, then they don't have access to the things that they need in order to become successful. Once you have a felony, kind of like Dr. Renee Mitchell said, it's very hard to vote, get a job, get student loans, be able to go to school. And so we have to be very conscious about how we are kind of policing our communities. And so racism was alive and well. We had segregation laws, and we had segregated neighborhoods. And so when a lot of these cities started to become much more urbanized and industrialized, all the jobs were kind of in these downtown kind of inner city areas. But because everyone was kind of flooding those areas in order to get jobs, a lot of the people who were wealthy and could afford it didn't want to live among what we would technically call like the poor immigrants, right? So this is where we started to see the development of suburbs. And so we started to see that people who could afford it could actually drive out to the outskirts of town and live there, and then come and work in the city. And we still obviously have that today. But we also have to recognize that there were like crazy racial segregation laws that said that basically if you were a person of color or an immigrant, you couldn't even think about living in those communities. And it wasn't really until the 1960s that integration was allowed. And so as a result, really people of color were very limited in where they could live, and basically where they could afford. And so once the development of all these suburban areas really happened, that's where a lot of the infrastructure, resources for infrastructure went. And so because of racial segregation, we have these very high crime areas that tend to be populated by people of color because of a lot of times racial segregation and racism that happened in the United States. It set them at a disadvantage in order to be able to climb or succeed to the American dream, because there are so many things put in place that really kind of allowed foster kind of white comfort, and were deliberately put in place in order to maintain white comfort. So when we talk about these high crime areas, and we look at these areas that don't look like they have good infrastructure, so many low-income neighborhoods don't have access to fresh food. They don't have easy access to major supermarkets, things like that. And so there's just a whole lot of disadvantages that perpetuate disorder in communities, and a lot of that is because of poverty and inadequate resources dedicated to them. So long story short, and as a result, we have these high crime areas, and so they were dedicating all these officers to those areas. And then as we started to see segregation happen, we started to see that the police kind of reemerged as not slave patrols, because slavery was outlawed, but really people in these white suburban neighborhoods did not want people of color in their neighborhoods, and it created kind of this fear and moral panic about people of color, which eventually led to what we now know as like these super predators, but we're not even there yet, because that was the 1990s. And so there was a ton of riots that were happening, the Watts riots, all the way to, if you watched Let It Fall, looking at the riots that happened in LA after the police officers who almost murdered Rodney King were acquitted. You had a lot of communities of color and disadvantaged communities who were already on the edge. They were so frustrated because of generations of police officers mistreating them fairly. And then now when we actually have it on videotape of officers using excessive force, they're not held accountable. And that set people off, and it led to a bunch of riots, and it led to a lot of the reforms that happened during the community policing era. So additionally with that, we also started to see the increase in technology, which was great because it made things a lot more efficient. But before technology, we had a lot of officers that were doing what we call foot patrol, meaning that they were out walking the streets, walking their beats, talking to neighborhood merchants, talking to citizens in the community. And once we started to get two-way radios, telephone booths, and even patrol cars, it really kind of created much more of a distance. And so instead of officers being out talking to citizens, they were now almost like in a physical barrier of a patrol car. So some policing scholars argue that the patrol car was even kind of reminiscent of this us versus them mentality. And so because there was a lot of tension between communities and the police, and crime was increasing despite all these efforts to reform policing. So remember, we saw the development of these criminology programs to teach about forensics, crime scene investigation, improving policing tactics. And the whole purpose was to professionalize this industry. But even though they're dedicating all these resources to making kind of like an elite police force throughout the United States, crime rates are still increasing. And so that became very frustrated to officers to have this mentality of being like, we're trying to be crime fighters, but people keep committing crime. And so it really created this tension of us versus them. And so it's us as police officers versus them as the community. And this goes back to some of the data that I showed on the very first day of class about this disconnect between police officers and the community. So most people in the community believe that they understand the challenges and realities of policing, whereas if you ask the same question to police, they do not. Most do not think that the community understands what it takes to be a police officer. And so that kind of embodies this us versus them mentality. And that survey was done in 2018. So this us versus them mentality has been perpetuated, for centuries, even up into this day, where officers do not feel like the community understands everything that they have to go through. And that can be fair, right? Because we call the police to deal with problems, and a lot of times we don't see how they deal with those problems. And a lot of times we don't want to see them deal with the problems. And so now that we are actually seeing them deal with the problems, a lot of people are like, I have questions. But police officers are saying, like, this is what we have to do. Like, there's no incidents of use of force that look nice. That is not, like, our job is to uphold respect and the dignity of others. But when you have someone that is on PCP, that taser's not working, things like that, like, that's when uses of force have to like escalate. So long story short, you have a lot of frustrated officers who feel like the community is attacking them, but also like, the community's frustrations were not unwarranted. They were very frustrated with the discrimination and the racism of policing, and the fact that crime rates were still rising, even though they were being fed all this information about how they're improving the police, and the police are getting so much better. And then what also did help is we, as criminologists, started to do a lot of research in police departments. So this is where we actually started to see a lot of kind of randomized control experiments. And so the first that we really kind of understand whether or not policing was working was the Kansas City Preventative Patrol. project, which basically was looking at this idea of, if we increase or decrease patrol in certain areas, how does that impact crime rates and how does it impact citizens' perception of crime? And so what it found was that, like, it didn't matter if we increased or decreased patrol in certain areas, it didn't have any impact on crime. And one which they argued is, and it also didn't have any impact on citizens' perception of crime. And the main reason was that most of the citizens didn't even know that an experiment was going on, which is important for validity reasons. But also, like, they didn't recognize whether or not there was an increase or decrease in patrol. So they didn't really have any impact on whether they viewed the patrol as effective. So that really kind of showed us that preventative patrol is not super effective. And studies have definitely added on this. And so we know that preventative patrol is effective if it's targeted and they have certain things to do, but just simply, assigning more officers to drive around a certain neighborhood does not have a dramatic impact on any type of Part 1 or 2 crimes. So because of that, and then we also had a lot of experiments with foot patrol experiments. So some jurisdictions had traditional patrol in the vehicles. Other jurisdictions, other neighborhoods had foot patrol officers. And so what they found is that even though foot patrol didn't really have a strong impact on reducing crime rates, it did significantly impact citizens' perception of crime rates. And a lot of that was because citizens noticed that there were a lot more officers in their neighborhoods, and they started to get to know who those officers were. And so they liked that they were able to see a visible presence in their community. And so as a result of that, they thought that crime rates were going down, even though the randomized experiment with the foot patrol showed that it didn't really have any impact in crime. And so this really led to the development of what we now call the community policing era. And so the community policing era really developed out of really kind of these 4 ideas. So we still had a lot of issues with communities of color and disadvantaged communities, and tensions between the police and the community. There was all this extra training and this focus on crime fighting that wasn't having any impact on crime rates at all. And then additionally, we started to see a lot of this research that was coming out to show that what had been traditionally done was no longer working. And so now we have to figure out, how are we going to improve our relationships with the community? And so that's where the community policing era came in. So because of the positive impact of the foot patrol studies, we developed the community, or the Office of Community-Oriented Policing, so the COPS office. And so they allocated tons of federal funding to police departments to basically develop these programs to build better relationships and partnerships with the community. And I'll talk about some of these. It also encouraged agencies to diversify the police. So up until this point, and still really to this day, policing is a predominantly male profession, generally predominantly white, and especially up until like the 1990s was predominantly white policing communities of color. And instead of putting an emphasis on fighting crime, it shifted from a reactive kind of crime fighting approach to much more of a proactive problem solver approach. And so I emphasize problems here a lot of because of the research that was coming out about broken windows. And the broken window theory is this idea that if you don't invest in communities, then criminals are going to move in, realize that nobody really cares about the community, and that's where they're going to commit crimes. And so it's this idea that, like, if you're walking by an abandoned building and there's like a broken window in the building, people are more likely to continue to throw rocks at the building because, like, clearly no one cares about it. It's an abandoned building, who cares? And so that leads to this idea of, if officers don't focus on these low-level kind of disorder problems, then that's going to increase crime. And so instead of officers being the ones that are responsible for addressing the crime, the community policing era really focused on officers developing partnerships with the community to develop problems in their neighborhood. So instead of focusing specifically on crime, officers now wanted to know of other issues that were going on. So is there issues with lots of abandoned cars? Is there issues with delinquent teens? Is there issues with loitering? Is there a lot of prostitution, drugs happening? Is trash not being picked up? Things like that. And so these are like disorder problems that were happening in communities. And so this whole idea of kind of the community-oriented policing was that officers were now going to have these neighborhood meetings, watches, town halls. And so officers were now permanently assigned to police certain neighborhoods. And so if they were assigned to a neighborhood, they were now that community policing officer. They were the neighborhood officer. And their job was to get to know everyone in the community, to get to know, stop by businesses, build those relationships, so that the community became much more comfortable with police. And so if there were any issues, they could go to the police, not only for crime-related issues, but problems, disorder problems that were happening in their communities. So these neighborhood officers would host these town hall meetings where people could show up and they could voice their concerns. And so the purpose of this was really for those officers to really kind of mobilize members in their communities to kind of take back their communities. And so this is where we started to see like a lot of neighborhood watches and neighborhood reinvigoration attempts. And so we found research that like when you start to clean up neighborhoods, so if you have a neighborhood that has a bunch of abandoned cars, empty homes, there's the grass isn't mowed, different things like that. If you can change that and develop ownership within that community, like you can actually reduce crime. So this is interesting because we also see this with kind of nice communities that have like HOAs that require like certain types of rules for you to maintain your property. And these go back to a lot of the broken windows policing, kind of crime prevention through environmental design. Is if you have neighborhoods that look nice, it shows that people care about those communities, and it's going to deter criminals from committing crimes in these communities. So really what was unique about community-oriented policing is instead of officers being the ones that are responsible for everything, they realized that they really needed the efforts of the community to help them. And so community-oriented policing, and we're going to talk about this a lot more when we get into strategies of policing, was really to develop co-partnerships to identify problems within their communities. So not necessarily crime, problems. So this is all good and great. And over time, we saw there's so many studies on community-oriented policing, and really kind of save you a whole PhD class on community-oriented policing. It really kind of boiled down to this idea. People would show up to the town hall meetings and they would voice their concerns about what they want the officers to focus on. But then nobody wanted to help the officers. They wanted to be like, oh no, I don't want to show up for a Saturday trash pickup. Like, you guys do that. Like, I'm just telling you that there's a ton of trash in the neighborhood. Please, I don't have to do anything. So they didn't want to work with the police. And then really community-oriented policing was not effective in every neighborhood because we're at the cusp of a lot of tensions in disadvantaged communities and communities of color and low-income communities that they didn't want to work with the police. They wanted officers to deal with the problems, but they didn't want to participate. And so what we found is the studies that showed that community-oriented policing were effective tended to be in the communities that were supportive of the police, kind of wealthier, predominantly white communities. They really liked community-oriented policing because they had respect for the police and you wanted to interact with them. And they were interested in policing and stuff like that. Where these low-income neighborhoods, like they needed the police to help them. They didn't want to be the ones that were working with the police to deal with these issues. They wanted officers to deal with them. And then we also started, and so the other issue was that like no single police department had the same definition of community policing. Everyone was doing something different and calling it community policing. And so what the typical scenario was like police departments would apply for this funding. They get a ton of federal funding, and then they would just basically designate a community-oriented policing officer. And that officer was responsible for, either a certain community policing unit. And so one of the units that I like to talk about that I thought was interesting, that I had personal experience with going on a ride along, was the Houston Apartment Enforcement Unit. And Houston is the 5th largest city in the United States. And so they have this specific community-oriented policing unit that basically goes to every single apartment complex in Houston within their jurisdiction. And they basically do SEPTED evaluation, so crime prevention through environmental design. They basically do a walk around of the apartment complex, and they identify all issues that violate like the city ordinances and things like that, but are also like safety violations. And so much of their job is really to pressure apartment managers to improve lighting, safety concerns in their areas. And what's great is that this effort doesn't have to resort to really law enforcement It's because a lot of these are just like civil codes and stuff like that. And so they could fine these agencies for not improving conditions. We have a ton of research that shows, like, if you increase lighting, install better locks, things like that, that can dramatically reduce crime. And so these are kind of these community-oriented policing units where they are working with the community to co-identify issues within their community. The whole emphasis is to really build better relationships with people in the community so that the community feels much more comfortable coming forward with things that officers aren't always seeing every day while they're patrolling their beats. So that was essentially kind of community policing, or the community policing era in a nutshell. And really, this is kind of one of the reforms that really shifted to a different focus kind of in the 21st century. So we don't really have any eras officially for the 21st century. We've kind of just touched on them, and it might just be because we're still in the 21st century. But we talked about the political era, where politics were basically police officers basically served at the arms of politicians, and there was a ton of corruption, and it wasn't a very fun job. It was basically rooted in the patronage system, where you just hired all your friends to carry out the mission of whoever was paying your salary. And so because of all the corruption and because of the political influence, that's where we got into the professional era, where you had a lot of policing reformers who were saying, like, let's make this an elite police force where they are trained, they're focusing on fighting crime, and we're increasing technology and all this stuff like that. But their emphasis on fighting crime led to very overly harsh kind of policing practices without the kind of bedside banner that is necessary in order to kind of instill cooperation. So they were so much focused on like just the facts. They were just considering themselves to be crime experts. They're not here to provide services. Like, they're there to investigate crimes, and that is their sole focus. And then we obviously saw that created a lot of issues and tension in the communities that they were policing. And so as a result of science showing that, what has been happening in your crime fighting efforts are really not working, and what does work is when people believe that officers are working in their community and preventing people from I don't know what that noise is. Oh, my watch. Sorry. There's a noise happening. So because of the policing policies, or the policing research that showed that really citizens interacting with officers in their community can actually improve citizens' perceptions of crime and be more willing to participate in the crime reduction efforts, led to the community policing era, where it shifted from a reactive crime fighting kind of focus to much more of a let's build relationships with the community, let's be partners with them, let's problem solve, let's figure out how we can actually reduce issues in the community and prevent crimes from happening. And the more that we can prevent crime by improving relationships with the community, the less we have to be reactive, and the lower that crime rates are going to be. So then, I don't know if you've heard about it, but we had something happen on 9/11, 2001. And that kind of shifted policing away from community-oriented policing in a sense. So still to this day, we have community-oriented policing programs and problem-oriented policing programs. And these two kind of strategies are different, and we'll talk about much more of the specifics in a couple of weeks when we talk about policing tactics. But these are still practices that are still happening, and that it can be very effective. If problem-oriented policing is done correctly, we can actually see dramatic reductions in certain types of crime and disorder. But really, after 9/11, we started to see kind of a shift to developing an emphasis much more on counterterrorism. And so this is where we had kind of one overarching government agency. We have the Department of Justice, and now we have two kind of overarching kind of law enforcement agencies. We have the Department of Justice, and then after 9/11, they created the Department of Homeland Security. So this is where we started to see a lot more emphasis on protecting the United States from domestic and international terrorists. So we saw a huge increase in surveillance and technology. So this is where we started to see a lot more like wiretaps and things like that. But also, like, a lot of major cities started to develop data hubs that were able to, let me back up. So they, like, especially in New York City after 9/11 happened, they increased surveillance cameras everywhere, and it caused a lot of concerns because everyone was just like, oh, this is going to be Big Brother, things like that. But it really was like, so if there were any like anthrax threats or terrorist attacks, like they could pull up cameras in a certain part of the city and they could document everything. And so this was very helpful in identifying the Boston Marathon bombers, things like that. So we just saw an increase in efforts to really reduce counterterrorism. We saw a lot more federal funding for agencies to develop, or a lot more federal funding for agencies to apply for grants for like terrorism grants. And so that's where we started to see a lot more police departments developing drone units. And anything really to, if they could argue is in terms of preventing terrorism, they could basically get a lot of these cool new toys and things like that. And then also we kind of started to see a little bit more of the militarization of police, but that really kind of came to head in like 2010, but definitely after kind of like the Ferguson era. So I wouldn't officially call 2001 to 2014 like the 9/11 era. We definitely saw a change in some of the focus on policing, but mostly just with increased improvements and enhancements in technology and much more surveillance and increasing security on our borders. And then in 2014, with the police killing of Michael Brown, it created what we are currently experiencing, which is that legitimacy crisis. And so we've kind of talked about this a little bit, but a legitimacy crisis is essentially police departments in the United States are struggling to gain legitimacy because of excessive uses of force, corruption, and a lot of what we are learning about the police and things like that. The community is starting to feel like the police shouldn't have the power that they have. And because of that, they don't want to comply. They're not going to help. They're not going to cooperate with the police. And so we learned from the professional era is when you do not have the buy-in of communities, you cannot impact crime. Police officers know that they need the community to help them investigate crimes. And that goes from, being witnesses, providing information. You have a lot of communities, one, that have kind of a double-edged sword where like the culture in the community is you don't snitch on anyone, so they don't cooperate with the police because they are legitimately feared that someone will kill them. But at the same time, you also have people living in communities that grow up with, they could have information to certain types of crime and they're not going to go to the police because they don't care about the police and things like that. And so officers know that, and they know that they can't solve crimes without the community's help. And so once we started to see a lot of these high profile shootings of unarmed Black men, it created a huge legitimacy crisis. We saw a rapid growth in the Black Lives Matter movement, really kind of drawing attention to kind of these, the centuries of police mistreatment of lower income communities, but especially against the lack of accountability that was happening for officers who were shooting and killing Black unarmed people of color. And so we are still reckoning with this. We kind of talked about in the first day is like now we're starting to see a lot more officers being held accountable. We see increased efforts to train officers not only in use of force, but implicit biases and things like that. But really kind of want to cover this idea is that we didn't know how often officers were using force. And still to this day, on January 20th, 2022, we still do not know exact estimates of how often officers use force. And whether that is, putting going hands-on to drawing their weapon to fully, shooting and killing someone. And so once we started to collect, once databases started to develop about this, and so the first one was the Washington Post, and I still believe today that's one of the most exhaustive databases of officer-involved shootings. It actually showed that officers were killing a lot more people than we realized. So about every year, it's about 1,000 killings by the police. And even though that represents less than 0.01% of all the citizen police interactions, it's still 1,000 people that were killed by the police that some believe is controversial, whereas, the majority of those, I'm not going to go that way. So Additionally, we're definitely seeing a lot more positives. We are seeing a much more increased transparency. We're seeing a lot more efforts to improve data collection and to keep track of what officers are doing. And then also, not only from like systemic issues in terms of reforming police departments, we've also started to see increases in legitimacy. We now are armed with our own smart devices that we can record police interactions and upload that in real time for everyone to see. Everyone has a smartphone, everyone's recording the police. But at the same time, we've also seen an increase in police departments adopting body-worn cameras. And so still to this day, not every police department has body-worn cameras. Not because they don't necessarily want to, is because they are insanely expensive and it requires a whole different kind of infrastructure. And we're still doing a bunch of research on it, but there are definitely a lot of positives that are coming out of officers having to wear body cams, not only for community members, but for police officers as well, in terms of being able to corroborate, evidence in cases. Sometimes domestic violence crimes are incredibly difficult to investigate, and especially when, a typical scenario is where you have an abuser who shows up to court dressed to the nines and is so sorry, pretends to be the best parent, all that stuff like that. And then now, and jurors can just sit there being like, well, it might have just been something that got out of hand, but then officers can show the body cam of, how angry that person was, how drunk they were. And so now we start to see, what actually happened going on. And so it definitely helps in terms of complaints against officers, because officers can refer to their body cam to show a lot more context to the complaints. But at the same time, it can also help with citizen complaints and justifying their efforts as well. So in terms of where we are going in the future, we are still in the midst of it. And so basically a lot of the takeaway from this is, the policing in the United States really developed from a lot of these European reforms that focused on prevention and professionalization of policing. Really, even before formalized police departments, we have had either vigilantes or responsibilities for someone in some society to really maintain order and prevent crime. However, a lot of racial tensions and tensions between the community and the police are really nothing new, because these have been happening for centuries. And to be fair, on one hand, it's like, yes, absolutely, the frustrations are justified given the behaviors of some of these officers that are disrespecting the badge and disrespecting the dignity of people, but also realizing that this is an institution that started really as a way for people in power to kind of control and make sure marginalized populations, immigrants, low income, people of color, didn't basically overthrow that power. And so once we started to go through history and every single person started to get rights, equal protection under the law, the dramatic social reforms in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s is constantly changing police. And so a lot of these reforms are happening when we, the people, are demanding that these reforms are happening. And we are seeing this in real time now. 15 years ago, agencies didn't have body cams, and it just sucks that we have to have a lot of these high profile incidents to actually create change in these police departments. But looking at it from a different perspective, we have to realize that policing is probably one of the main government institutions that have gone through so many reforms because of how visible they are. And again, like, the issues that we have with the police are not unique to the police. We also see this in medical fields, in academia, and other things. So anything that really has that can be a historical agency that's been around for a long time, it's likely that there are policies and procedures in place that are rooted in policies and procedures that were originally designed to discriminate against certain people. And so it's our job as future practitioners and criminologists and professionals to really kind of change the way that things have been happening for the better, so that we as the people can get people in the right positions to be the ones that serve and protect our community.